The bank manager's face went white as he stared at my father's old debit card. "Ma'am, please wait here. Don't move. Don't leave." His hands shook as he picked up his phone. "I need to call someone immediately." I had walked into Harbor State Bank with $3 in my purse and nowhere to sleep. My husband Mark had taken everything: our condo, our accounts, even my Social Security benefits. All I had left was this faded piece of plastic my father gave me 40 years ago. "Emergency only, kiddo," he had said. "If you're ever completely broke." Well, I was completely broke now. But as the branch manager rushed back with legal documents I'd never seen before, as security guards appeared and whispered into radios, I realized Mark had made one fatal mistake. He had never asked what my mechanic father had really been building in secret. If you're hearing this story, tell me in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from? Before we begin today's story, please don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Now, let's get started. The afternoon heat pressed against Grace Miller's kitchen window like an unwelcome visitor, making the glass fog with humidity that never quite lifted in Tampa's relentless summer. At 62, she had learned to move slowly through these oppressive hours, conserving energy the way her mother had taught her to stretch groceries during the lean years after her father's accident. Grace sat at the small Formica table that had served as her command center for 12 years. Sorting through the day's mail with the methodical patience of someone who understood that small details, left unattended, could grow into disasters. Her arthritic fingers moved carefully through each envelope, the joints stiff and swollen despite the anti-inflammatory pills she took religiously each morning. Beside her left elbow, her Medicare card lay flat against the table's surface, its red, white, and blue design worn soft around the edges from years of handling. Next to it, a Social Security benefits letter bore the official seal that still made her stomach tighten with the anxiety of someone who remembered when such letters brought news of cuts and delays. She picked up a pencil, its yellow paint chipped from use, and circled the date of her next check on the small calendar she kept beside her pill organizer. August 3rd. Still 11 days away. Grace set the pencil down and rubbed her fingers, working the ache from the knuckles that had once moved with the quick precision of a hospital laboratory technician. "Just stretch it a little longer," she whispered to herself, a mantra she had been repeating with increasing frequency as Mark's construction business continued its mysterious slide toward insolvency. The sound of the garage door rumbling to life made her glance at the kitchen clock. 3:20 in the afternoon. Mark was home early again, the third time this week. Grace smoothed her cotton blouse and tucked a strand of gray hair behind her ear, an automatic gesture that had become habit whenever she heard his approaching footsteps. The front door opened with its familiar protest against the humidity, followed by the sharp click of expensive shoes across tile flooring. Mark appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing his navy pinstripe suit, the one that still carried the lingering scent of cologne mixed with something else she couldn't quite identify. Asphalt, perhaps, or the particular smell of construction sites in summer heat. His eyes moved immediately to the mail spread across her table, scanning each piece with the quick efficiency of someone cataloging inventory. Grace watched his gaze stop on a thick envelope bearing the Medicare logo, her name printed in bold black letters across the front. "How was your day, honey?" she asked, but Mark was already moving toward the counter, his hand extending toward the Medicare envelope with casual ownership. "Busy," he replied, his fingers closing around the envelope before Grace could process what was happening. "Lots of paperwork to catch up on." The envelope disappeared into his leather briefcase with a movement so smooth and practiced that Grace wondered, for just a moment, how many times she had watched this exact sequence without truly seeing it. "That one had my name on it," Grace said quietly, her voice carrying the careful neutrality she had learned to use when questioning Mark's decisions about their joint affairs. Mark's laugh came too quickly, too sharp. "You know how confusing all that Medicare jargon gets, Gracie. Remember what happened when you tried to call them about your prescription coverage last month? You were on hold for 2 hours and still couldn't understand what they were telling you about deductibles and co-pays." The memory stung because it contained enough truth to make Grace doubt her own instincts. She had hung up that day feeling smaller, more invisible, like her voice carried no weight in the machinery of bureaucracy that seemed designed to exhaust elderly people into submission. I could try to read it myself, she suggested, watching Mark's face for the micro-expressions she had learned to interpret over 20 years of marriage. Why stress yourself? Mark snapped the briefcase closed, the brass clasps making a sound like handcuffs. I'll go through it tonight and explain anything important. You know I've always got your best interests at heart. His smartphone buzzed against the granite countertop, the vibration seeming to echo through the kitchen's hard surfaces. Grace watched the screen illuminate with a message preview, white text floating across a dark background like a secret trying to surface. Kylie can't wait for tonight. Wear that blue tie I picked out for you. The words hung in Grace's vision for perhaps 3 seconds before Mark lunged for the phone, his fingers closing around it with desperate urgency. But 3 seconds had been enough. Grace felt something cold and heavy settle in her stomach as she processed what she had seen. Mark, she said carefully, who's Kylie? Mark's jaw tightened, the muscles working beneath his skin as he searched for words that would redirect her suspicion. Client, he said finally, his tone carrying the forced patience he used when explaining things he believed she couldn't understand. Very demanding. You know how these high-maintenance types get when they're investing big money in construction projects. The phone buzzed again in his grip, and Grace could see the tension spreading through his shoulders. White-knuckling the device like he was trying to crush something dangerous. She buys you ties? Grace asked, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Mark's response came too fast, defensive in a way that made Grace's chest tighten. It's a professional relationship, Grace. Sometimes clients give gifts to show appreciation for good work. It doesn't mean anything. But even as he spoke, Mark was moving toward the refrigerator, where their monthly mortgage statement hung beneath a magnet shaped like a flamingo. Its pink paint faded from years of Florida sunshine. He tapped the paper with one knuckle, the sound sharp and final. You should be thanking me instead of asking jealous questions, he said, his voice shifting to the tone he used when their neighbors complained about his late-night phone calls. Or the unfamiliar cars that sometimes appeared in their assigned parking space. This condo is only safe because I had the sense to refinance it properly. Put everything in my name so we could get decent rates. Grace felt the words hit her like cold water. Everything? The bank needed someone with actual business experience on the paperwork. Someone they could trust to handle payments and legal obligations. Mark's smile looked painted on, artificial around the edges. You wouldn't understand all the financial complexity, sweetheart. Hell, you get confused trying to program the coffee maker. The phone in his pocket buzzed again. Grace counted the vibrations like heartbeats, each one driving home the reality that someone else was claiming her husband's attention. Someone whose messages made him smile in ways that had nothing to do with construction contracts or professional relationships. I've been signing a lot of forms lately, Grace said, testing the waters. Estate planning, retirement preparation, all routine stuff. Mark kissed the top of her head, his lips feeling cold against her scalp. The important thing is that you're protected. I handle all the complicated financial decisions so you can focus on your hobbies and volunteering. Her hobbies. Grace thought about the library books stacked on her nightstand, the crossword puzzles she completed each morning over coffee. The volunteer work at the animal shelter that made her feel useful and connected to something larger than her own shrinking world. When had the things that brought her joy been reduced to hobbies? Spoken with the same dismissive affection someone might use to describe a child's finger painting? Mark's phone continued its insistent buzzing as he gathered his briefcase and headed toward his home office. Claiming urgent calls from West Coast clients who worked different time zones. The door closed behind him with a definitive thud that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Grace remained at the kitchen table, staring at the remaining mail scattered across the surface. A grocery store flyer advertising senior discounts. A letter from her church about the upcoming charity drive. A credit card offer addressed to current resident, as if her name had already begun the process of erasure from official records. She opened the junk drawer beside her elbow, pushing aside rubber bands. Expired coupons and loose batteries until her fingers found what they were looking for. A debit card, its magnetic strip worn smooth from age, embossed with 2 names in fading gold letters, Henry Cole, and Grace Elizabeth Cole. The bank logo was nearly rubbed away, but she could still make out the outline of an anchor beneath the words, Harbor State Bank. Grace held the card up to the afternoon light streaming through her kitchen window. Henry Cole had been a man who spoke in straight lines and simple truths. Who owned a small gas station on the outskirts of Clearwater and understood the weight of every dollar that passed through his oil-stained hands. He had worked 16-hour days to put Grace through college, his back bent from decades of crawling under cars to fix other people's problems. The day she left for her freshman year, standing beside the Greyhound bus that would carry her toward a future. He could only imagine he had pressed this card into her palm with fingers rough as sandpaper. "Emergency only, kiddo," he had said, his voice hoarse from years of cigarettes and worry. "If your ship's ever going down, if you got nowhere else to turn, this here's your anchor. Promise me you'll remember that." She had laughed then, 22 and certain that life would unfold like a map she could read perfectly. The card had lived in her wallet ever since, buried beneath newer plastic and updated identification. A relic from a time when she believed in her own unsinkability. Grace slipped the card back into the drawer and closed it quietly. But something about touching it had shifted the air in the kitchen, as if her father's presence had stirred briefly in the humid afternoon heat. From down the hallway came the murmur of Mark's voice, intimate and warm in a way that made her chest ache with recognition. She couldn't make out specific words, but she could hear the rhythm of affection. The cadence of desire that had been missing from their conversations for longer than she cared to calculate. That evening, Grace sat on their leather couch pretending to watch the evening news while Mark remained locked behind his office door. Claiming urgent business with clients who supposedly worked West Coast hours. The television droned about Medicare fraud investigations sweeping across Florida. Elderly victims who had trusted the wrong people with their social security numbers and life savings. "Thank God you don't have to worry about any of that nonsense," Mark called from the kitchen, where ice clinked against glass as he poured his nightly whiskey. "All those poor old folks getting scammed because they tried to handle things they didn't understand." Grace pulled her cardigan tighter despite the warm air flowing from the ceiling vent. On screen, a woman about her age wept as she described discovering that her adult son had forged her signature on loan documents. Stealing her pension to fund his gambling addiction. "It's terrible," Grace murmured, but her voice was lost beneath the air conditioning's steady hum and the distant sound of Mark's laughter as he talked to someone who made him sound young and hopeful. When Mark finally emerged from his office at 10:30, his phone screen was alive with unread messages, each notification casting brief flashes of light across his face. He set the device face down on the coffee table, but Grace could see illumination leaking around its edges with every incoming text. "Big day tomorrow," he announced, kissing her forehead with lips that tasted like expensive scotch and secrets. "Early meetings, late dinners. Don't wait up." Grace nodded and smiled, the expression feeling like a mask that no longer fit the contours of her face. "I'll be fine." But as she lay in their bed that night, listening to the ceiling fan's familiar wheeze and Mark's carefully controlled breathing, Grace felt something fundamental shifting beneath the surface of her carefully constructed life. His phone sat charging on the nightstand, buzzing periodically with messages that made his sleeping face twitch toward small, secret smiles. She closed her eyes and tried to summon the memory of her father's voice, the absolute certainty in his tone when he told her that every ship needed an anchor. That preparation was the only defense against the storms that life inevitably sent. Tomorrow, Grace decided as sleep finally pulled her under, she would ask to see that Medicare envelope. Tomorrow, she would start reading the fine print herself. But tonight, in the space between consciousness and dreams, she pressed one hand against the nightstand drawer where her father's wisdom waited in patient darkness, and wondered if Henry Cole had somehow known that this storm was coming. 8 days later, Grace Miller sat in the molded plastic chair of Bayshore Medical Center's waiting room. Her hands folded in her lap like a schoolchild waiting to be called to the principal's office. The air hung thick with the institutional smell of antiseptic and floor wax, punctuated by the constant rustle of paper gowns and the muffled conversations of medical staff. Moving through corridors that seemed designed to muffle hope. She had arrived 45 minutes early for her annual physical. A habit inherited from her father's belief that punctuality was a form of respect for other people's time. The magazine in her lap a dog-eared copy of Health and Wellness. After 60, remained unopened as she watched other patients navigate the complex choreography of American healthcare. An elderly man shuffled past the reception desk, clutching a folder thick enough to contain a novel. His wife followed behind, her face wearing the exhausted expression of someone who had spent months fighting insurance companies and medical billing departments. Grace caught fragments of their conversation with the clerk, something about denied claims and out-of-network providers. Words spoken with the weary resignation of people who had learned that the system designed to protect them could just as easily bankrupt them. The waiting room television played a morning news program with the sound barely audible above the hum of air conditioning and nervous coughing. Grace found herself focusing on a banner that crawled across the bottom of the screen: Medicare fraud investigation expands across Southeast. She looked away quickly, unsure why the words made her stomach clench. Grace Miller? A young nurse appeared beside her chair, clipboard in hand and wearing scrubs decorated with cartoon cats that seemed aggressively cheerful in the sterile environment. "Dr. Patterson will see you now." Grace followed the nurse down a hallway lined with health awareness posters, heart disease statistics, diabetes prevention tips, and warnings about prescription drug abuse. One poster featured stern-faced seniors pointing accusingly at shadowy figures, with dollar signs for eyes, warning about Medicare scams targeting elderly Americans. Grace quickened her pace, as if the poster might follow her with its judgmental gaze. "Step right up here," the nurse said, gesturing toward a digital scale that looked like something from a spaceship. "Let's see what we're working with." Grace stepped onto the platform carefully, watching the red numbers flicker and settle. She had lost 4 pounds since her last visit, not through any intentional diet, but through the kind of weight loss that happened when worry replaced appetite, when sleep came in. Fragments interrupted by the sound of Mark's phone and the growing certainty that her life was shifting beneath her feet like sand at low tide. Blood pressure next. The nurse wrapped the cuff around Grace's upper arm, the Velcro making a harsh ripping sound as it sealed. The machine hummed to life, squeezing with mechanical persistence until Grace's fingers tingled. "Little elevated today. Are you feeling anxious about anything specific?" Grace almost laughed at the understatement. "Nothing unusual." The lie came easily now, polished smooth by repetition. She had been practicing variations of it for weeks at the grocery store when the cashier mentioned that she looked tired, at church when Mrs. Henderson commented that she seemed distracted during the service, in the bathroom mirror each morning, when she applied concealer to the dark circles under her eyes that seemed to deepen daily. "Dr. Patterson will be right with you." The nurse led her into an examination room that smelled like rubber gloves and industrial-strength disinfectant. The paper on the examination table crackled as Grace settled onto it, her feet dangling like a child's, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She waited 23 minutes, listening to the sounds of a busy medical practice, muffled conversations, the ping of computer notifications, someone crying softly in a neighboring room. The wall clock above the examination table ticked with metronomic persistence, each second marking time toward a conversation she wasn't sure she was prepared to have. Dr. Patterson finally arrived, his gray hair slightly disheveled and his white coat bearing the wrinkled evidence of a long morning. He had been Grace's physician for nearly a decade, long enough to know about Mark's business troubles, her father's death from emphysema, the miscarriage she had suffered in her early 40s when they were still trying for children. "Grace." His smile seemed genuine, but tired around the edges. "How are you feeling these days?" "Mostly fine," Grace replied carefully. "Maybe a little more tired than usual. Trouble sleeping sometimes." Dr. Patterson nodded as he settled into a rolling chair, making notes on her chart. They went through the routine questions: sleep patterns, appetite changes, exercise habits, current medications. Grace answered as honestly as she could, given that honesty itself had become a complicated concept in her daily life. "Any significant changes in your routine recently? Major stress factors?" Dr. Patterson's pen paused over her chart. "Sometimes physical symptoms can be early indicators of psychological or emotional strain." Grace's fingers twisted together in her lap. "My husband has been taking over more of our financial management, retirement planning and estate organization. Sometimes it feels overwhelming to watch him handle so much responsibility. That's very common during this life transition." Many couples reorganize their financial arrangements as they age. Dr. Patterson's expression remained professionally neutral. Are you staying involved in the decision-making process? The question hung in the air like smoke. Grace thought about the stack of papers Mark brought home each week, the forms he guided her through with his hand covering hers as she signed, the way he explained complex legal language in the tone people used with confused children. Mark handles the complicated aspects, she said finally. I trust his judgment. Dr. Patterson looked up from his notes, studying her face with the careful attention he usually reserved for concerning lab results. Grace, I need to discuss something with you. Something that came to our attention through our billing department. Something cold settled in Grace's stomach. What kind of something? Dr. Patterson opened a manila folder she hadn't noticed him carrying. We received several inquiries this week about claims submitted under your Medicare number. For procedures and services you've never received at our practice. The examination room seemed to contract around Grace as she processed his words. I don't understand. Someone has been billing Medicare for expensive medical services using your personal information. The most recent claims were for cardiac imaging and specialized consultations at facilities you've never visited. Dr. Patterson slid a printout across the narrow space between them. These procedures allegedly took place on days when you were here for routine visits. Grace stared at the document, the numbers and medical terminology swimming together like alphabet soup. The letterhead read, Tampa Bay Specialty Cardiac Center, an address she didn't recognize in a part of the city she rarely visited. But I've never been there, she whispered. I know. That's why our office contacted Medicare directly. Dr. Patterson's voice carried the careful patience of someone delivering bad news. This appears to be systematic fraud, Grace. Someone with access to your personal information has been filing false claims for months. The word, fraud, seemed to echo in the small room. Grace felt heat rising to her face, shame mixing with confusion in a way that made the walls seem to close in around her. Who would do something like that? She asked, though even as the words left her mouth, she felt the cold weight of suspicion settling in her chest. Usually, it's someone close to the victim. Someone with regular access to Social Security numbers, Medicare cards, medical histories. Dr. Patterson leaned forward slightly. Someone who handles their financial affairs. Grace's mouth went dry. She thought about Mark's briefcase, always locked and always within reach. The Medicare envelope he had taken from their kitchen counter just last week. The stack of forms she had signed without reading, trusting his explanations about retirement planning and legal protection. What do I do? She managed to ask. First, we report it to Medicare's Fraud Investigation Unit. Then you'll need to request complete records of all claims filed under your name. Dr. Patterson handed her a business card with phone numbers printed in small, precise type. You should also check all your financial accounts, credit reports, any services linked to your Social Security number. Grace stared at the business card until the numbers blurred together. My husband usually handles all that. The silence that followed felt heavy as wet concrete. Dr. Patterson cleared his throat gently, choosing his words with obvious care. Grace, given the circumstances, I think it would be advisable for you to handle this matter personally. Without involving anyone else until we understand the scope of the problem. Grace nodded, slipping the card into her purse with fingers that trembled slightly. The paper felt dangerous, like evidence of something she wasn't ready to acknowledge. There's something else, Drive. Patterson continued, pulling another document from his folder. Someone attempted to change your primary care physician last month. The request was submitted electronically, allegedly with your authorization. Change it to whom? A physician in Clearwater. Dr. Marcus Webb. Dr. Patterson watched her face carefully. Do you know him? Grace shook her head. Clearwater was an hour away across the bay, a city she associated mainly with childhood memories of visiting her father's gas station. She had no medical connections there, no reason to seek treatment so far from Tampa. Except that Harbor State Bank was in Clearwater. Her father's old bank, where that faded debit card might still connect her to some forgotten account. The change request was denied due to incomplete documentation, Drive. Patterson explained, but it suggests someone was trying to redirect your medical records systematically. Grace felt something shift inside her chest, like tectonic plates realigning after years of mounting pressure. The confusion and self-doubt that had been clouding her thoughts began to crystallize into something sharper, more focused. "Dr. Patterson," she said carefully, "if someone was stealing from Medicare under my name, how much money could they take?" "It depends on the procedures they claim to perform. Some specialized treatments run into tens of thousands of dollars. Over time, if left undetected." He paused, selecting his words carefully. The financial impact could be quite substantial. Grace thought about Mark's new suits, the expensive restaurant charges on their credit card that he dismissed as business dinners. The way he had been paying for home improvements with cash instead of their usual financing options. She thought about Kylie's text messages and the scent of unfamiliar perfume that seemed to cling to his clothes. Despite his explanations about client meetings and construction site visits. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for telling me." Dr. Patterson stood and moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. "Grace, if you need help navigating any of this, please don't hesitate to call our office. And remember, you have every right to understand what's happening with your own medical and financial information." Grace nodded, but her mind was already elsewhere, calculating and remembering. How long had Mark been intercepting her mail? How many documents had she signed without reading the fine print? How many times had he dismissed her questions with that practiced smile and the gentle condescension of someone speaking to a confused elderly woman? She left the medical center with a folder full of printouts and phone numbers, walking through the parking garage in a daze. Her car, a 12-year-old Honda Civic that Mark kept threatening to replace with something more appropriate for someone her age, sat waiting in the shade of a concrete pillar. Inside the vehicle, Grace sat with her hands on the steering wheel, not turning the key. The parking garage was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional slam of a car door echoing off concrete walls. She pulled out her phone and stared at the Medicare fraud hotline number Drive Patterson had given her. Her finger hovered over the dial button. What if she was wrong? What if there was a reasonable explanation for everything the insurance claims? The attempted physician change, the mysterious medical procedures she couldn't remember having? Mark had always been the one who understood complicated paperwork, who spoke the language of bureaucracy with a confidence she had never possessed. But then she remembered the look in Dr. Patterson's eyes when he mentioned that fraud usually involved someone close to the victim. She thought about the Mercedes parked in their garage that Mark claimed to be leasing through his construction company. Though she had never seen paperwork for it. She thought about the cash payments he made for their condominium fees. Peeling hundreds from a wallet that seemed perpetually full despite their supposedly tight retirement budget. Grace started the engine and drove home slowly, taking surface streets instead of the highway, needing time to process what she had learned. The Tampa afternoon pressed against her windshield like a fever dream. Palm trees and strip malls wavering in the heat haze that made everything look uncertain and impermanent. At home, she rode the elevator to the 15th floor in silence, the building's air conditioning humming around her like the sound of secrets being kept. The hallway was empty, thick with the silence of a residential tower full of people who had learned not to ask too many questions about each other's business. Mark's car was gone from their assigned parking space. Grace let herself into their condominium and stood in the entryway, listening to the familiar sounds of home, the ice maker cycling in the refrigerator, the distant hum of traffic from the street far below, the ceiling fan wobbling in their bedroom. Everything exactly as she had left it that morning, and yet somehow different, as if the conversation with Dr. Patterson had shifted the fundamental frequency of her domestic life. She walked to the kitchen and opened the junk drawer where she kept her father's old debit card. Her fingers found it immediately, the plastic warm from years of hiding in darkness. She pulled it out and studied the embossed numbers, the faded bank logo, her own maiden name pressed into the plastic beside her father's. Emergency only, kiddo. If your ship's ever going down, use this. Grace closed the drawer and walked to the living room windows that overlooked Tampa Bay. 15 floors below, traffic moved in patterns she couldn't discern from this height. Boats cut white lines across blue water. The world continued its business while she stood suspended between what she had believed about her life and what she was beginning to understand might be true. She thought about calling Mark directly, asking him about the Medicare claims and the mysterious physician in Clearwater. But something in Dr. Patterson's careful words stopped her, the gentle warning that fraud usually involved someone with access to personal information, someone close to the victim. Instead, Grace sat down at their kitchen table and spread out the printouts drive. Patterson had given her phone numbers for Medicare fraud reporting, copies of claims submitted under her name for procedures she had never undergone, instructions for requesting complete medical and financial records. The afternoon sun shifted across the table, illuminating dust motes that danced around her head like tiny warnings. Grace picked up her phone and dialed the first number on Dr. Patterson's list. Medicare fraud hotline, a woman's voice answered after 3 rings. "How may I assist you?" Grace took a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs, from some reservoir of strength she hadn't known she possessed. "I think," she said carefully, "someone has been stealing from Medicare using my name." 2 weeks after her conversation with Dr. Patterson, Grace Miller stood in the elevator of her condominium building, her small suitcase handle cutting into her palm as she counted floors toward what she still thought of as home. She had spent 3 days in Orlando, caring for her old friend Margaret, who was recovering from knee surgery, sleeping on an uncomfortable pull-out couch and managing medication schedules that reminded Grace how quickly independence could slip away. The bus ride back to Tampa had been longer than expected, delayed by traffic accidents and mechanical problems that left Grace stiff and tired. Her legs ached in the cheap sandals she had meant to replace before the trip, and her cotton blouse stuck to her back. Despite the aggressive air conditioning that made the other passengers huddle in their sweaters. But she felt relieved to be home, to be returning to familiar surroundings where she could process the questions that had been building during her time away. Questions about Medicare claims and mysterious physicians, about the phone calls Mark had taken during her brief conversations from Margaret's landline. Always stepping out of the room when his phone rang, always returning with explanations about urgent client meetings and construction deadlines. The elevator climbed past floors filled with other people's lives, the sound of television programs, the smell of dinner cooking, the distant argument between neighbors that seemed to happen every Tuesday evening. Grace shifted her weight from one foot to the other, anticipating the moment when she could set down her suitcase and ask Mark the questions she had been rehearsing for days. The elevator doors opened on the 25th floor, revealing the familiar hallway with its beige carpet and generic landscape paintings. Grace walked toward their unit, her footsteps muffled by the thick padding that was supposed to suggest luxury but mostly just deadened sound. At their door, she fumbled in her purse for her key fob, the plastic card that had worked perfectly for 3 years. She pressed it against the electronic lock, watching for the green light that would welcome her home. The lock blinked red. Grace frowned and tried again, pressing the fob more firmly against the sensor. Red again. She could hear music coming from inside their condominium. Something jazzy and unfamiliar, accompanied by the sound of laughter that seemed to bounce off their hardwood floors. "Mark?" she called, rapping her knuckles against the door. Her voice sounded smaller than intended in the empty hallway. The music continued, but the laughter stopped. Grace heard footsteps moving across their living room, the soft padding of bare feet on expensive flooring. Her heart began to pick up speed as she realized that someone was inside their home, someone who wasn't answering her calls. The door opened slowly, revealing Mark in a way Grace had never seen him before. He stood in their doorway wearing a plush hotel-style bathrobe, its white terry cloth bearing a stain that looked suspiciously like lipstick near the collar. The scent of someone else's perfume wrapped around him like invisible smoke, sweet and cloying in a way that made Grace's stomach clench. Behind Mark, partially visible through the crack in the door, a much younger woman moved across their living room. She wore a silk camisole that caught the afternoon light streaming through their windows. And she laughed as she reached for a champagne glass that sat on their coffee table beside what looked like a bottle of Dom Perignon. "Oh," Mark said flatly, as if Grace were a delivery person who had arrived at an inconvenient time. "You're back early." Grace felt the words hit her like cold water. "Early? Mark, it's Thursday afternoon. I told you I'd be home today." She gestured helplessly at her suitcase, at the hallway around them, at the electronic lock that had denied her entry to her own home. "Why doesn't my key work? Who is she?" The younger woman, blonde, probably in her 30s, with the kind of confident posture that came from never having to worry about Medicare claims or Social Security benefits, turned toward the door with curious eyes. She wore the expression of someone watching an interesting television program, entertained but not particularly invested in the outcome. "Grace, honey," Mark said, his voice carrying the same tone he used when explaining complex financial documents. "This is Kylie. She's been helping me with some interior design consultations for the new development project." Grace stared at the woman who had been sending heart emojis to her husband's phone. Kylie smiled and gave a little wave, as if they were being introduced at a pleasant social gathering rather than Grace's own living room. "Interior design?" Grace's voice cracked slightly. "In our home? Wearing that?" Mark stepped into the hallway and pulled the door partially closed behind him, creating a barrier between Grace and whatever was happening inside their condominium. The gesture felt like a slap, a physical manifestation of how thoroughly she had been excluded from her own life. "Grace, I think you need to understand something," Mark said, his voice carrying a new edge, harder than the casual condescension she had grown accustomed to. "You've been having some episodes lately. Memory problems, confusion about dates and appointments. Kylie has been helping me document these incidents for your own protection." The hallway seemed to spin slightly around Grace as she processed Mark's words. "Episodes? What are you talking about? I don't have memory problems. Sweetheart, last month you forgot that you had signed the power of attorney forms. The week before that, you couldn't remember giving me permission to handle your Medicare correspondence." Mark's tone was patient, clinical, like a doctor explaining a terminal diagnosis to a confused patient. "We've discussed moving you to a more appropriate living situation. Somewhere with better support for people dealing with cognitive decline." Grace felt her grip tighten on her suitcase handle. The plastic cut into her palm, but the pain helped her focus on what was happening. "Mark, I remember everything perfectly. I never forgot signing those papers. I never gave you permission to intercept my mail. And I certainly never agreed to move anywhere." Mark's expression shifted to something Grace had never seen before, a mixture of irritation and calculation that made her realize she was looking at a stranger wearing her husband's face. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he said, his voice rising slightly. "The confusion, the paranoia, the inability to accept help when it's offered." He gestured toward the elevator lobby, where a neighbor was pretending to check their mailbox while obviously listening to every word. "Mrs. Patterson, you can see what I'm dealing with. My wife has become increasingly unstable. She can't manage her own medications, she gets lost trying to navigate simple errands, and now she's having delusions about our living arrangements." Grace felt heat rising to her cheeks as she realized Mark was performing for an audience, creating a narrative that painted her as an unreliable narrator of her own experience. The neighbor, a woman Grace had exchanged polite greetings with for years, looked away quickly, embarrassment mixing with what looked uncomfortably like pity. "I'm not confused," Grace said, but her voice sounded weak against Mark's confident assertions. "I'm not paranoid, and I'm certainly not unstable." Mark pulled a thick manila envelope from the pocket of his bathrobe, as if he had been prepared for this exact conversation. "These are the preliminary divorce papers, Grace. And a separation agreement that protects both our interests while ensuring you get the care you need." Grace stared at the envelope, noting that it was already unsealed, the papers inside bearing official stamps and notarization marks. "When did you? How long have you been planning this?" "Since it became clear that your condition was deteriorating beyond what I could manage at home." Mark's voice carried the smooth authority of someone who had rehearsed this speech. "You came into this marriage with nothing, Grace. No assets, no significant income, no real contribution to our financial stability. The separation agreement simply formalizes what was always true. This is my home, purchased with my business income, maintained through my financial management." The words felt like physical blows. Grace looked around the hallway that she had walked through thousands of times, past the doors of neighbors who had nodded to her in the elevator and chatted with her by the mailboxes. Everything looked exactly the same, but she felt like she was seeing it through a stranger's eyes. "Mark, you can't just decide I don't live here anymore," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice despite the chaos in her chest. "Actually, I can." Mark's smile was cold now, all pretense of affection stripped away. The condominium is in my name only, has been for 2 years now. The mortgage, the insurance, the homeowners association fees all handled through my business accounts. You have no legal standing here. Grace heard movement inside the condominium, the sound of Kylie's laughter, mixing with music that seemed inappropriately cheerful for the destruction of a 20-year marriage. Through the crack in the door, she caught a glimpse of their living room, their furniture rearranged, different artwork on the walls, champagne glasses and what looked like women's clothing draped over the chair where Grace used to read her library books. My things, she said weakly. My clothes, my photographs, my books. I'll have them packed and sent to whatever address you provide. Mark spoke like he was discussing the disposal of unwanted furniture. The important thing is that you understand this decision is final. Kylie and I are planning a future together, and that future doesn't include the complications of caring for someone who can't take care of themselves. The elevator at the far end of the hallway chimed, and Grace could hear footsteps approaching. Mark glanced past her shoulder, his expression shifting to something like anticipation. Building security, he announced loudly enough for the approaching footsteps to hear. I called them when I saw you trying to break into the apartment. This woman used to live here, but she's been having some mental health episodes. I'm concerned for her safety. Grace turned to see 2 uniformed security guards walking toward them, their faces wearing the neutral professionalism of people who dealt with domestic disputes on a regular basis. Behind them walked the building's property manager, a thin man in an expensive suit who looked like he would rather be anywhere else. Ma'am, one of the guards said gently, we need to ask you to come with us to sort this situation out. Grace looked back at Mark, searching his face for any trace of the man she had married, the person who had promised to love and cherish her through sickness and health, for richer and poorer. But all she saw was a stranger who had grown tired of the inconvenience of her existence. Mark, she said quietly, I don't understand how this happened. How did we get here? For a moment, something flickered in his expression, perhaps memory, perhaps guilt. But then Kylie's voice called from inside the apartment, asking who was at the door, and Mark's face hardened again. You never understood anything, Grace. That's why you're standing in a hallway with a suitcase instead of building a life worth living. He stepped back into the doorway, his hand on the door handle. The guards will help you figure out where to go from here. The door closed with a soft click, followed by the sound of the deadbolt engaging. Grace stood in the hallway holding her suitcase, facing 2 security guards and a property manager who looked like they were calculating the least complicated way to remove her from the building. Ma'am, the property manager said carefully, I'm going to need to see some identification and proof of residency. Grace opened her purse with shaking hands, pulling out her driver's license and searching for anything that might prove she belonged in this building, on this floor, in the life that had just been taken away from her. But as she looked through her wallet, she realized that Mark had been right about one thing. Her name appeared on very little of the official paperwork that defined their shared existence. The last thing she saw before the elevator doors closed was Kylie, wrapped in the bathrobe Grace had bought with her first retirement check from the hospital laboratory, raising a champagne glass in what might have been a toast or a farewell. The security guard's hand on Grace's elbow was gentle but firm as they rode the elevator down 15 floors to the lobby, the numbers counting backward like a reverse chronometer, marking the end of her life as she had known it. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished steel doors, a 62-year-old woman holding a small suitcase, her gray hair disheveled from the bus ride, her cotton blouse wrinkled with the exhaustion of someone who had suddenly become homeless in her own city. Ma'am, I'm really sorry about this, the younger guard muttered as they reached the ground floor. But if your name's not on the lease or the mortgage, there's nothing we can do. Building policy. Grace nodded because speaking seemed impossible. The lobby around her looked exactly the same as it had that morning when she left for the bus station. Expensive marble floors, oversized abstract paintings. The kind of generic luxury that was supposed to suggest success and stability. But now it felt like a movie set, beautiful and artificial and completely disconnected from her reality. Is there someone you can call? The property manager asked, his voice carrying the professional compassion of someone who dealt with domestic emergencies on a regular basis. Family member? Friend who could pick you up? Grace thought about Margaret, still recovering from surgery in Orlando. Her church friends, most of whom lived in retirement communities and had enough problems of their own. The co-workers from the hospital laboratory who had scattered to different lives after the layoffs 5 years ago. "I'll figure something out," she said quietly. The automatic doors slid open, releasing Grace into the Tampa afternoon that hit her face like a furnace blast. The sun glared off windshields and concrete with an intensity that made her squint as she walked toward the street. Her suitcase wheels bumping over pavement cracks that seemed designed to trip elderly people carrying everything they owned. Traffic rushed past on the busy avenue that separated her former building from the rest of the city. Cars honking, motorcycles revving, the constant background noise of a metropolitan area that had no time for personal disasters. Grace stood on the sidewalk feeling like a stone in a river, watching the flow of normal life continue around her immobility. "How did I become a guest in my own life?" she whispered to herself, the words lost in the sound of engines and exhaust fans. With nowhere else to go and no clear destination in mind, Grace began walking toward Tampa Bay. Her feet already ached in the sandals she had chosen for comfort during bus travel, but movement seemed better than standing still. While the full weight of her situation settled over her like a heavy blanket. She passed joggers with expensive headphones and designer athletic wear, young couples walking dogs that probably cost more than Grace's monthly grocery budget. Elderly men playing chess in Bayshore Park while their wives fed breadcrumbs to seagulls. Everyone seemed to know where they belonged, to have some claim on the space they occupied. Grace found an empty bench facing the water and finally allowed herself to sit down heavily, the metal slats cutting into her thighs through her thin skirt. Her suitcase toppled over beside her, its cheap wheels spinning in the breeze that carried the smell of salt water mixed with fried food from a nearby vendor. She pulled out her phone, a basic model that Mark had chosen because it was appropriate for someone her age, and stared at the battery indicator showing 4% charge. Her hands shook slightly as she opened the banking app she had installed months ago, but rarely used, trusting Mark's assurances that he was monitoring their accounts properly. The first screen made her stomach drop. Their primary checking account, the one linked to Mark's business and their shared expenses, showed a balance of $0. Their savings account displayed the same digital emptiness. Grace scrolled down to their small IRA, the retirement fund she had contributed to during her years at the hospital laboratory, and found a notation she didn't understand: account closed per authorized request. A notification popped up at the top of her screen: your Social Security direct deposit has been redirected to account ending in 7834. Grace stared at the numbers, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Account ending in 7834. She had never opened an account ending in those numbers. She had never authorized anyone to redirect her Social Security benefits. "So I really am nobody on paper now," she said aloud, her voice barely audible over the seagulls and the distant sound of traffic. A bitter taste filled her mouth as she realized the full scope of what Mark had accomplished. Not just the condominium and the mortgage, but every financial connection that tied her to the normal world. Bank accounts, retirement funds, government benefits, all of it redirected away from her and toward some system of control that left her invisible to the institutions that were supposed to provide security in her old age. The sun was beginning to set over Tampa Bay, painting the water in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Grace watched boats moving across the harbor, expensive yachts and working fishing vessels, sharing the same water, each following routes that made sense to their captains. She opened her purse and counted the contents of her wallet. 3 crumpled $20 bills, some loose change, and a handful of plastic cards that might or might not work anymore. Her Medicare card, worn soft around the edges. Her driver's license with an address she could no longer claim. A library card from the Hillsborough County system. And beneath everything else, the faded debit card with her father's name embossed beside hers. Grace pulled out the Old Harbor State Bank card and held it up to the dying light. The plastic had yellowed with age, the magnetic strip worn smooth from decades of being carried but never used. She ran her thumb across the raised letters of her maiden Name Grace Elizabeth Cole, and tried to remember the woman who had carried this card through college and her early career, before marriage had gradually erased her individual financial identity. The memory came back in fragments, scattered pieces of a conversation that had happened more than 40 years ago. Her father standing beside her car in the parking lot of the bus station, his mechanic's hands rough with years of engine oil and honest work. The smell of coffee and cigarettes that seemed to cling to all his clothes, mixed with the Florida sunshine that turned everything hazy and dreamlike. "Emergency only, kiddo," he had said, pressing the card into her palm with the gravity of someone passing down family treasure. "If your ship's ever going down, if you got nowhere else to turn and the world's trying to convince you that you don't exist, this here's your life preserver." At 22, Grace had laughed at his serious tone, certain that life would unfold according to plans she could control and understand. The card had seemed like an unnecessary precaution, a relic of her father's Depression-era mentality that saw disaster lurking around every corner. Now, sitting alone on a park bench as darkness fell over Tampa Bay, Grace finally understood what Henry Cole had been trying to protect her from. Not just financial hardship, but the complete erasure of her identity. The systematic removal of every piece of paper and every account number that proved she existed in the bureaucratic systems that defined modern American life. "Am I just old clutter he threw to the curb?" she asked the empty air, her voice mixing with the sound of waves lapping against the seawall. Streetlights began to flicker on around the park, casting pools of yellow light that made the gathering darkness feel less threatening. Grace pulled her thin cardigan tighter around her shoulders and tried to imagine what came next. A homeless shelter? A welfare office? Some government program designed for elderly people who had fallen through the cracks of the American dream. Cars continued to glide past on the street behind her, their headlights sweeping across the park like search beams that never quite stopped to investigate what they had illuminated. Grace felt invisible in a way that had nothing to do with the darkness, as if Mark's pronouncement that she didn't exist had somehow been accepted by the universe as official policy. But the card in her hand felt solid, real in a way that transcended the digital erasure of her bank accounts and the legal maneuvering that had stolen her home. Her father had built something that was supposed to outlast his life, something designed to catch her if she fell. "Tomorrow," Grace whispered into the humid night air, her fingers closing around the faded plastic like a lifeline. "Tomorrow I walk into a bank as someone who still has a name." She curled up on the park bench as best she could, using her suitcase as a makeshift pillow and her cardigan as a blanket that provided more psychological comfort than actual warmth. The metal slats pressed into her back and hips, creating pressure points that would leave her stiff and sore by morning. But for the first time in months, Grace felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. Not the false optimism that came from denial or wishful thinking, but the solid possibility that her father's planning might have anticipated this exact moment, this complete collapse of everything she had trusted. Cars passed through the night, their tires humming against asphalt like a mechanical lullaby. Somewhere across the water, boats moved through darkness toward destinations Grace couldn't see but somehow believed existed. And in her hand, worn smooth by decades of patient waiting, Henry Cole's final gift held the promise that even when the world tried to erase her, some part of Grace Elizabeth Cole would remain. At 9 o'clock the next morning, Grace Miller stood outside the brick facade of Harbor State Bank. Her wrinkled clothes and sleepless eyes marking her as someone who had spent the night navigating the thin line between hope and desperation. The building sat in an older section of Clearwater, surrounded by family-owned restaurants and second-hand shops that spoke to a different era of American commerce. The bank's exterior bore none of the glass and steel ostentation of the modern financial institutions Mark preferred. Instead, it offered the solid reassurance of red brick and brass fixtures. An anchor-shaped logo etched into glass doors that had been polished by decades of working people seeking honest financial services. Grace pushed open the heavy door, hearing the soft chime that announced her arrival to the nearly empty lobby. The air inside smelled like old paper and fresh coffee, not the sterile ozone of corporate branch offices. Sunlight filtered through Venetian blinds, casting parallel lines of light and shadow across worn carpet that had been chosen for durability rather than fashion. Behind the teller counter, a young man with kind eyes and a name tag reading, Evan, personal banker, looked up from his computer screen. His smile began automatically, the professional greeting every bank employee learned. But shifted when he saw Grace's rumpled appearance and the desperate exhaustion written across her face. "Good morning," he said carefully. "How can I help you today?" Grace approached the counter with the slow deliberation of someone who understood that this conversation might determine whether she continued to exist in any meaningful way. She set her purse on the marble surface and withdrew the faded debit card with both hands, treating it like a religious artifact that might crumble if handled roughly. "I don't know if this even works anymore," she said quietly. "My father opened the account for me decades ago. I've never used it, but he told me it was for emergencies." Evan took the card gently, studying the embossed names and the worn magnetic strip. "Henry Cole and Grace Elizabeth Cole," he read aloud. Wow, this card design is from the late 70s, maybe early 80s. Let me see what I can find." He swiped the card through his reader, frowning when the first attempt failed to register. Grace felt her chest tighten as she watched him try again, then turned to his computer to type commands she didn't understand. "Huh," Evan muttered, scrolling through screens of green text that looked like something from the early days of computing. "This account isn't showing up in our standard system. It's old enough that it might be archived on our legacy servers. Give me a minute to dig deeper." Grace pressed her fingertips against the marble counter to stop her hands from shaking. If this card led nowhere, if her father's emergency plan had been lost to bank mergers and computer updates, she had no backup strategy. No family to call, no friends with resources, no safety net. Beyond whatever social services might be available to elderly women who had somehow become invisible to the modern world. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice sounding smaller than she felt. Evan suddenly pushed back from his computer, his eyes wide with something that looked like disbelief. "Ms. Cole, I mean, Ms. Miller, I need to get my branch manager. This is definitely not a standard checking account." He stood quickly, nearly knocking over his coffee mug in his haste to reach the door marked, "Manager." Grace watched him disappear into the back office, leaving her alone in the lobby with only the sound of air conditioning and distant traffic to fill the silence. Minutes passed. Grace counted them by the ticking of a wall clock that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet bank. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished surface of the counter, an elderly woman who looked like she had spent the night on a park bench, because that's exactly what she had done. The manager's door opened with a sharp click, and a woman in her 50s walked out with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to solving problems quickly. Her nameplate read, "Maria Rodriguez, branch manager." And her expression carried the professional neutrality that came from years of delivering both good and bad financial news. "Ms. Miller," she said, extending her hand. "I understand you have some questions about an old account." Grace shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact that suggested competence rather than sympathy. "I'm not sure what kind of account it is. My father set it up before I went to college. I've never used it." Ms. Rodriguez gestured toward a small office behind the counter, its glass walls offering privacy while maintaining visibility to the rest of the bank. "Why don't we sit down and talk about what we've found?" They settled into chairs that had been chosen for comfort rather than style. The kind of furniture that encouraged honest conversation rather than hurried transactions. Ms. Rodriguez spread several printed documents across her desk, each bearing the distinctive letterhead of Harbor State Bank. "Ms. Miller, what Evan discovered is quite unusual," she began carefully. "Your father didn't just open a checking account. He established what we call a beneficial entity, Harbor Legacy Holdings LLC, with you listed as the sole member and beneficiary." Grace stared at the documents, trying to process words that seemed to belong to someone else's financial reality. "I don't understand. What does that mean?" "It means you don't just have a bank account. You own a company." Ms. Rodriguez turned her computer screen so Grace could see a portfolio listing that seemed to scroll for pages. Harbor Legacy Holdings owns several parcels of land outside Tampa, rental properties in working-class neighborhoods, and early equity shares in a healthcare technology company that went public last year. The numbers on the screen swam together as Grace tried to make sense of what she was seeing. Real estate holdings, stock portfolios, asset management accounts, all of it somehow connected to the faded debit card her father had pressed into her palm 40 years ago. But how is that possible? Grace asked. My father owned a gas station. He worked with his hands. He didn't know anything about business companies or stock investments. Ms. Rodriguez smiled for the first time since entering the office. According to our records, your father was quite a bit more sophisticated than he let on. He started making small real estate purchases in the 1970s, buying cheap land that developers would eventually want. He reinvested the profits into more properties, then diversified into early-stage technology companies. She scrolled to another screen, showing a steady progression of transactions spanning decades. Everything was held in trust for you, structured so that you couldn't access it until certain conditions were met. What conditions? The account would only be fully activated if your personal liquid assets dropped below a minimal threshold. Ms. Rodriguez pointed to a line in the legal documents. Essentially, if you ever had nothing left, this company would automatically become available to you. Grace felt tears blurring her vision as she began to understand the depth of her father's planning. He had somehow anticipated not just financial hardship, but complete erasure, the possibility that someone might systematically strip away every official connection between Grace and her own life. At the bottom of the computer screen, a scanned document appeared in Henry Cole's familiar handwriting. If the world strips my daughter bare, Harbor Legacy Holdings stands up around her. She is never alone as long as this company exists. Your father left something else, Ms. Rodriguez said gently. She retrieved a sealed envelope from her desk drawer. Its edges yellowed with age and Grace's maiden name written across the front in her father's careful script. Grace opened the envelope with trembling fingers, unfolding a letter that still carried the faint scent of motor oil and coffee that had always clung to her father's work clothes. My dear Grace, the letter began. If you're reading this, then someone has tried to convince you that you don't matter, that you're too old or too confused to manage your own affairs. I'm writing to remind you that you come from people who built things to last. Who understood that real security comes from planning ahead and never trusting anyone completely with your future. The words continued, explaining how Henry Cole had watched his own mother lose everything to a bad second husband during the Depression. How he had sworn his daughter would never be trapped without options. I'm not giving you this money to spoil you or to make your life easy, the letter concluded. I'm giving it to you so that when someone thinks you're too old to fight back, you can remind them that you still sign your own name. Build something good with what I've left you, kiddo. Make it count. Grace pressed the letter to her chest, breathing in the faint smell of old ink and her father's enduring love. For the first time since Mark had closed the door of their condominium in her face, she felt something stronger than despair settling in her bones. He knew, she whispered. Somehow, he knew this could happen. Ms. Rodriguez nodded. Your father was very clear in his instructions. Harbor Legacy Holdings has been waiting for you for 40 years, growing and preparing for the day when you might need it. Grace looked at the numbers on the screen again, seeing them clearly for the first time. Enough to live on comfortably. Enough to fight back. Enough to prove that Grace Elizabeth Cole had never been erased. Had never been nobody, had always been her father's daughter with her own resources and her own power. What do I do now? She asked. Ms. Rodriguez smiled and reached for her phone. Now, Ms. Miller, we introduce you to your company. And then we start planning how you want to use it. 3 days after discovering Harbor Legacy Holdings, Grace Miller sat in a downtown Tampa law office that would have intimidated her just a week earlier, but now felt like the natural environment for someone who had been conducting business for 40 years without knowing it. The conference room's floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the bay, while expensive artwork and legal diplomas suggested the kind of expertise that could navigate complex financial crimes. Across the polished mahogany table, David Chen, the forensic accountant recommended by Ms. Rodriguez, spread documents that told the story of Grace's systematic financial victimization with the precision of a medical examiner detailing a cause of death. What we're looking at is textbook elder abuse, David said, his voice carrying the controlled anger of someone who had seen too many variations of this particular crime. Mark used your social security number to open lines of credit. forged your signature on mortgage refinancing documents, and redirected your government benefits to accounts you never authorized. Grace studied each page as David turned them, seeing her own name attached to debts she had never incurred and benefits she had never received. Medicare claims for procedures she had never undergone. Credit cards opened in her name and maxed out on expenses that had nothing to do with her life. The scope is impressive, David continued, his tone suggesting grudging professional appreciation for the complexity of Mark's scheme. He's been building this for at least 3 years, slowly transferring assets and redirecting income streams while keeping you distracted with forms that you thought were routine retirement planning. Grace felt fury sharpening her spine as she recognized her own signature on document after document, sometimes genuine, sometimes skillfully forged, but always binding her to financial obligations she had never agreed to assume. "What about the Medicare fraud?" she asked. David pulled out a thick folder labeled "Insurance Fraud Documentation." $47,000 in false claims over 18 months. The billing was sophisticated. Whoever did this had access to your complete medical history and knew enough to submit believable procedures. Grace thought about the Medicare envelopes Mark had been intercepting, the medical appointments he claimed to schedule on her behalf, the insurance calls he insisted on handling personally. Can you prove he did it? With enough investigation, yes. But prosecution for elder abuse requires evidence that will stand up in federal court. And Mark has been careful to create plausible deniability for most of his actions. David set down his pen and looked directly at Grace. "However, there's another approach we might consider." Grace felt something shift in the air between them, a sense that the conversation was moving from diagnosis to treatment. "What kind of approach?" David smiled, and Grace saw something predatory in his expression that made her feel, for the first time in months, like she was on the winning side of a negotiation. "Harbor Legacy Holdings isn't just your safety net, Grace. It's a fully functional investment entity with significant assets and legal standing. We could use it to acquire Mark's debts rather than pursue him through the criminal justice system." Grace frowned, not quite following the logic. Acquire his debts? Mark's construction company is leveraged to the maximum. Outstanding invoices, equipment loans, supplier agreements. Most of his business operation runs on debt that gets sold and traded like any other commodity. David pulled out another set of documents. Harbor Legacy Holdings could purchase those debts through intermediary entities, essentially making you Mark's primary creditor. The implications began to crystallize in Grace's mind. "And as his creditor, I would have legal authority to collect." "Exactly. Instead of waiting for prosecutors to build a criminal case, we use the civil courts to recover everything he stole plus interest and penalties." David's smile widened. "It's perfectly legal, and much faster than traditional justice." Grace felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun streaming through the conference room windows. For months, she had felt like prey hunted by someone who understood systems she couldn't navigate. Victimized by her own trust and inexperience with financial manipulation. But Harbor Legacy Holdings changed the rules of engagement. It gave her weapons Mark didn't know she possessed, resources he had never considered in his calculations. "How long would it take?" she asked. "To acquire the debts? 2 weeks, maybe 3. To begin collection proceedings?" David checked his calendar. "We could file paperwork by the end of the month." Grace thought about Mark's confidence as he had explained that she would leave with nothing. His casual dismissal of her intelligence and capability, the way he had performed her incompetence for their neighbors as if it were an established medical fact. "Do it," she said quietly. Over the following week, Grace established residence in a comfortable extended stay hotel suite paid for by Harbor Legacy Holdings. The room overlooked Tampa's downtown district, offering a view of the city from the perspective of someone who belonged there rather than someone passing through. Her evenings were spent reading financial documents with the methodical attention her father had once applied to repairing engines. David Chen had provided her with copies of every form Mark had used to steal her identity, every signature he had forged, every debt he had created in her name. The bedside table held her father's letter, her pill organizer, and a fresh notebook where she wrote questions and observations instead of worries and complaints. For the first time in years, Grace felt her mind sharpening rather than accepting the confusion that Mark had insisted was inevitable for someone her age. I've been acting like a guest in my own life, she told her reflection in the hotel bathroom mirror. That ends now. David's legal team worked with surgical precision, using shell companies and intermediary purchases to acquire Mark's business debts without revealing Harbor Legacy Holdings' involvement. Each transaction was documented and verified, building an ironclad legal position that would become apparent only when they were ready to exercise it. Grace updated her appearance not for vanity, but as armor for the battle ahead. A simple navy blazer that suggested competence without ostentation. Comfortable low-heeled shoes that still made satisfying clicks on marble floors. A new pair of glasses that made reading fine print easier. And gave her face the sharp focus of someone accustomed to examining details that others preferred to overlook. When she practiced introducing herself in the hotel room mirror, "I'm Grace Miller, sole owner of Harbor Legacy Holdings," her voice no longer trembled with uncertainty. Instead, it carried the quiet authority of someone who had discovered that power was not about dominance, but about having options when other people tried to take them away. On a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after discovering her father's legacy, Grace signed the final documents that made Harbor Legacy Holdings the primary creditor for nearly every significant debt associated with Mark's construction business. David spread the papers across the conference table. Like a winning poker hand, each signature representing another piece of leverage in the confrontation that was coming. "He'll receive notification tomorrow," David said. "Certified mail to his business address, with copies to his attorney and his primary bank. Full disclosure of the debt acquisition and a formal demand for payment within 72 hours." Grace picked up the summary document that listed every invoice, every equipment loan, every supplier agreement that now belonged to her through Harbor Legacy Holdings. The numbers were substantial enough to destroy Mark's business and personal finances if he couldn't pay immediately. "What if he tries to claim I'm mentally incompetent to own a company?" Grace asked. David's smile was sharp with anticipation. "Then he'll have to explain to a judge how someone who was supposedly too confused to manage her own Medicare bills was capable of systematically acquiring his business debts through sophisticated legal entities." The incompetence defense works both ways. Grace felt something she hadn't experienced since before her marriage: the satisfaction of being several steps ahead of someone who had underestimated her intelligence. Mark had taught her to doubt her own judgment, to defer to his expertise in all matters involving money and legal authority. But he had never considered the possibility that her father's mechanic hands had been connected to a mind that understood long-term planning, strategic thinking, and the patient accumulation of power that could remain hidden until the moment it was needed most. "Tomorrow," Grace said, closing the document folder with a decisive snap. "Tomorrow, Mark learns that I never stopped signing my own name." Mark Miller first heard the name, Harbor Legacy Holdings, during a networking lunch at the Tampa Bay Business Association, where conversations about construction contracts mixed with complaints about labor costs and property taxes. He sat at a table of developers and contractors, men who had known each other for decades and shared war stories about difficult clients and problematic projects. "Anybody else been getting calls from this Harbor Legacy outfit?" asked Tom Richardson, a commercial developer whose projects usually involved strip malls and office complexes. "They've been buying up construction debts across the county. Paying cash, no questions asked." Mark's attention sharpened as he processed the implications. Debt acquisition was a common practice in construction, but usually involved major financial institutions or specialized collection companies. A private entity buying multiple debts suggested either serious money or serious expertise. "What kind of debts?" Mark asked, trying to sound casually interested rather than suddenly concerned. "Outstanding invoices, mostly. Equipment loans, supplier agreements." Tom shrugged. "Smart money, whoever they are. They're buying distressed debt at 60 cents on the dollar and then collecting the full amount through legal channels." Mark's phone buzzed against his leg, but he ignored it in favor of gathering intelligence about this mysterious investor. His own construction company carried substantial debt, nothing unusual for the industry, but enough to be problematic if someone decided to call it all at once. "Anyone know who's behind it?" asked another developer. "Shell company, far as I can tell. But they've got serious legal backing. My attorney says their paperwork is bulletproof." Tom took a sip of his martini. Whoever it is, they're not playing games. Mark's phone buzzed again, more insistently. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from his assistant, urgent call from Harbor Legacy Holdings. They want to schedule a meeting ASAP. The coincidence made Mark's chest tighten, but he forced himself to maintain the casual expression of someone discussing abstract business trends rather than potential personal threats. Interesting, he said aloud, while privately calculating which of his debts might be vulnerable to acquisition, and how quickly he could restructure them if necessary. That afternoon, Mark returned to his office to find his assistant holding a stack of certified mail receipts and looking more stressed than usual. The return address on each envelope bore the logo of Harbor Legacy Holdings, an anchor surrounded by the words, "Established 1978. "They've been calling all afternoon," his assistant explained. "Very polite, very professional. But they made it clear that time is a factor in whatever they want to discuss." Mark retreated to his private office and opened the first envelope, scanning the legal language with growing disbelief. Harbor Legacy Holdings had acquired the outstanding debt on his primary equipment. Loans, excavators, trucks, and specialized machinery that formed the backbone of his construction operation. The second envelope contained notice that they had also purchased his largest supplier agreements, making them the creditor for thousands of dollars in materials and subcontractor services. The third envelope stopped Mark's breathing entirely. Harbor Legacy Holdings now owned the delinquent invoices from his most recent project, the luxury condominium development that was supposed to solve his cash flow problems and fund his future with Kylie. In total, they controlled debts approaching $300,000, enough to force his company into bankruptcy if they demanded immediate payment. Mark reached for his phone with trembling fingers and dialed the number listed on each document. Harbor Legacy Holdings, a professional female voice answered. "How may I help you?" "This is Mark Miller, Miller Construction. I received some documents today. I think there might be some mistake." "Mr. Miller, thank you for calling. We've been hoping to hear from you." The voice remained pleasant but carried an undertone of steel that made Mark's palms sweat. "Harbor Legacy Holdings would like to schedule a meeting to discuss your outstanding obligations. Are you available tomorrow afternoon?" Mark tried to calculate how much cash he could access on short notice, which assets he could liquidate quickly, and whether there were any legal challenges he could mount against the debt acquisition. "I'll need to consult with my attorney first," he said carefully. "Of course. We'll be meeting at the historic Vinoy Renaissance Resort, Conference Room B. 2 o'clock tomorrow. We look forward to resolving this matter quickly and professionally." The line went dead before Mark could respond. That evening, Mark paced his condominium, the one he had stolen from Grace, through forged documents and legal manipulation, trying to develop a strategy for dealing with Harbor Legacy Holdings. He called his attorney, who confirmed that debt acquisition was perfectly legal and that the paperwork appeared to be in order. "Who are these people?" Mark demanded. "I can't find much information," his lawyer admitted. "Shell company registered in Florida, but the beneficial ownership is buried under several layers of legal entities. Whoever they are, they have serious money and excellent legal representation." Kylie sprawled on the couch in silk pajamas, painting her nails and half listening to Mark's increasingly frantic phone calls. She had been attracted to his confidence and apparent wealth, but his current anxiety was making her reconsider the relationship. "Baby, why don't you just pay them?" she suggested. "It's not like you don't have money." Mark almost laughed at her naivety. His construction company operated on credit and cash flow, not liquid assets. The lifestyle he had been funding, the expensive dinners, the luxury car, the designer clothes for Kylie, had been financed through Medicare fraud and the systematic theft of Grace's identity. "It's not that simple," he said tersely. The next afternoon, Mark dressed in his most expensive suit and drove to the Vinoy Renaissance Resort, a historic hotel that overlooked Tampa Bay with the kind of old money elegance that intimidated people who hadn't grown up around wealth. He arrived early, hoping to gain some psychological advantage through preparation and punctuality. Conference Room B was wood-paneled and formal, with windows that offered a view of boats moving across blue water. A man in his 30s sat at the far end of the conference table, reviewing documents with the methodical attention of someone accustomed to complex financial transactions. Mr. Miller? The man stood and extended his hand. David Chen, representing Harbor Legacy Holdings. Thank you for coming. Mark shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact that suggested competence rather than intimidation. I have to say, your company's debt acquisition strategy has caught me off guard. We prefer to work efficiently, David replied, gesturing toward a chair. Please, have a seat. We have quite a bit to discuss. Mark settled into the offered chair, his mind racing through possible negotiation strategies. He had spent years convincing elderly clients to trust him with their finances, using charm and authority to overcome their natural caution. But David Chen appeared to be immune to such manipulation. I understand you've acquired some of my company's outstanding debts, Mark began carefully. I'm sure we can work out a reasonable payment schedule. David smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. Actually, Mr. Miller, Harbor Legacy Holdings is prepared to offer you a more comprehensive solution. Before Mark could respond, the conference room doors opened with a soft whisper of expensive hinges. Mark turned toward the sound, expecting to see another attorney or perhaps a senior executive from Harbor Legacy Holdings. Instead, he saw Grace. She walked into the room wearing a navy blazer and carrying herself with a posture he had never seen before, straight-backed and confident, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who belonged in business conferences and financial negotiations. Her gray hair was professionally styled, and she wore glasses that made her look scholarly rather than confused. Grace? Mark stammered, his voice cracking slightly. What are you doing here? What is this? Grace took a seat at the conference table directly across from Mark, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She placed a leather portfolio on the table and opened it to reveal the documents that would define the rest of their conversation. I'm here as the sole owner and primary decision-maker for Harbor Legacy Holdings, she said quietly. I'm here because you told me I was nobody, Mark. And I wanted to prove you wrong. Mark's face cycled through expressions: confusion, disbelief, growing comprehension, and finally a fear that made his hands shake against the polished mahogany surface. That's impossible, he said weakly. Grace, you don't understand what you're doing. You can't own a company. You don't know anything about business or finance. Grace pulled a summary sheet from her portfolio and slid it across the table toward Mark. The document listed every debt Harbor Legacy Holdings had acquired, every piece of leverage they now held over his construction company and personal assets. You're right, Grace said calmly. I don't know much about business. But I'm learning, and I had excellent teachers. David Chen leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying the clinical precision of someone delivering a medical diagnosis. Mr. Miller, Harbor Legacy Holdings now owns approximately $300,000 in debts associated with your construction company. We're prepared to offer you 72 hours to pay in full, or we'll begin foreclosure proceedings on your equipment, accounts, and personal assets. Mark's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. He looked between Grace and David, his mind struggling to process how his elderly ex-wife, the woman he had dismissed as confused and incompetent, had somehow become his primary creditor. Grace, this is crazy, he finally managed. We can work this out. We've always worked things out. Grace reached into her portfolio and withdrew another document, a thick folder labeled Elder Abuse Evidence. She opened it to reveal copies of forged signatures, fraudulent Medicare claims, and unauthorized financial transfers that documented years of systematic theft. No, Mark, she said, her voice carrying a strength that seemed to fill the conference room. We can't work this out. Because you didn't just steal my money. You tried to steal my name, my history, my right to exist as a person with her own thoughts and decisions. Mark's face flushed red as he realized that his usual combination of charm and gaslighting wasn't going to work in this environment. The woman sitting across from him was not the confused elderly victim he had been manipulating for years. You preyed on a senior citizen, David added, sliding forward a binder of evidence that could support criminal charges. Medicare fraud, identity theft, elder abuse, forged signatures on legal documents. The system you manipulated so carefully is about to talk back. Mark looked around the conference room as if searching for escape routes or allies who might intervene on his behalf. But there were only windows overlooking Tampa Bay and the sound of his own panicked breathing. Grace, he said desperately, if you do this, you'll destroy everything. The business, the employees, the projects that are already under construction. Is that really what you want? Grace stood slowly, gathering her documents with the careful attention she had once applied to laboratory samples and medical tests. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried the weight of someone who had thought long and hard about justice and consequences. What I want, she said quietly, is for you to understand that stealing from elderly people has real consequences. What I want is for you to learn that underestimating someone's intelligence is a very expensive mistake. She looked directly into Mark's eyes, seeing the man who had systematically erased her identity and replaced it with his own vision of what an elderly woman should be: confused, dependent, grateful for any attention. You told me I was nobody, Mark. You told me I would leave with nothing. Grace closed her portfolio with a decisive snap. But my father taught me that preparation is the only defense against people who mistake kindness for weakness. Mark tried once more to find some purchase on his old authority, some way to regain control of a narrative that had completely escaped his management. Grace, please, think about what you're doing. Think about us, about our history together. Grace paused at the conference room door, her hand resting on the handle as she considered how to end 20 years of marriage and 2 years of systematic abuse. Our history, Mark, is evidence in a federal investigation. Your future is what you should be thinking about now. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Mark alone with David Chen and the sound of boats moving across water toward destinations he could no longer reach. 1 year later, Grace Miller stood on a gentle rise overlooking Tampa Bay, watching construction crews frame the final building of what would become the Henry Cole Wellness Center. The morning breeze carried the sounds of purposeful work hammers ringing against steel, the backup beepers of cement mixers, the cheerful profanity of workers who took pride in building something meant to last. The sign at the construction entrance was modest but clear: affordable senior housing and community health clinic funded by Harbor Legacy Foundation. Below the main text, in smaller letters that only careful readers would notice, in memory of Henry Cole, who taught his daughter that real security comes from lifting others up. Grace lived now in a comfortable one-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of the first completed building. Her windows facing east toward the water where she could watch the sunrise paint the sky in shades of possibility. The apartment was smaller than the condominium Mark had stolen from her. But it belonged to her completely, not through marriage or legal maneuvering, but through her own decisions and her father's long-term planning. Her walls were lined with framed photographs that told the story of her new life. The church group that had rallied around her during the legal proceedings, the neighbors who had become genuine friends rather than polite acquaintances, the residents of the senior community, who now helped each other navigate Medicare forms and identify potential scams before they could take root. The kitchen counter held her pill organizer beside a 3-ring binder labeled Financial Fraud Prevention Workshops. Twice a week, Grace taught classes in the community center, showing other seniors how to read their Medicare EOBs, Social Security statements, and loan offers with the critical attention that could mean the difference between security and victimization. The most important thing to remember, she would tell each new group, laying documents flat on folding tables and guiding arthritic hands to the signature lines, is that this is still yours. Your name, your benefits, your right to understand what you're signing. Don't let anyone rush you past the fine print, and don't let anyone convince you that asking questions makes you difficult. Harbor Legacy Holdings had grown under Grace's guidance, always with the same rule that governed every investment decision. No projects that displaced elderly residents from their homes. No partnerships with companies that targeted vulnerable populations. No profits generated from other people's confusion or desperation. David Chen had become not just her financial advisor but a trusted friend who joined her on the apartment balcony. Some evenings to watch the sun set over water that reflected the lights of a city that had learned to see her as a force rather than a victim. You turned revenge into infrastructure, he had joked during one of those sunset conversations. That's rare. Grace had smiled, understanding that her father's legacy had given her something more valuable than money: the power to choose how her story would end, and the resources to write that ending in concrete and steel, and the quiet satisfaction of people who no longer had to choose between medication and rent. The court proceedings had unfolded with the methodical precision of a well-documented case. Mark's appeals were denied, his assets seized, his construction company dissolved to pay restitution to Medicare and the dozens of creditors he had defrauded. Kylie had disappeared the moment his credit cards stopped working, leaving behind only the silk pajamas Grace had found in her former bedroom and a forwarding address that led nowhere. The judge's final statement had been read into the court record with the weight of official recognition. Today we acknowledge that Mrs. Miller was not incompetent or confused. She was systematically exploited by someone who used her trust as a weapon against her independence. This court finds that her current business achievements demonstrate clearly that the alleged cognitive decline was a fabrication designed to facilitate financial abuse. Grace had listened to those words from the front row of the courtroom, flanked by women from her church, who had filled the gallery in a show of support that felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. For the first time in years, the official record of her life reflected who she actually was rather than who someone else needed her to be. This afternoon, as she did every Tuesday, Grace received an envelope from the court system, updates on appeals that had been denied, motions that had been dismissed, the bureaucratic housekeeping that marked the end of Mark's legal options. She read each document once, filed it under closed, and felt nothing stronger than the quiet exhale that came with finishing a difficult book. The chapter was over. The story continued. As evening approached, Grace pulled out her father's letter one final time, unfolding the yellowed paper that had guided her from homeless desperation to purposeful prosperity. The words remained the same, but her understanding had deepened with experience, and the confidence that came from honoring his wisdom through action rather than just memory. Build something good with what I've left you, kiddo. Make it count. Outside her apartment windows, lights glowed in the homes of families who no longer worried about housing costs or medical emergencies, who attended financial literacy classes and supported each other through the challenges that came with aging in America. The Henry Cole Wellness Center would open next month, offering primary care and preventive services to residents who had learned that staying healthy was a community effort rather than an individual struggle. When Grace signed her name now on donation checks, on construction contracts, on the volunteer forms that connected her to organizations fighting elder abuse throughout Florida, the ink felt steady and sure. Grace Cole Miller, founder, carried the weight of someone who had discovered that power was not about dominance, but about creating systems that protected people who couldn't protect themselves. She set down her pen and walked to the balcony, where Tampa Bay stretched toward the horizon like a promise that the world was larger than any single person's attempt to diminish it. The water reflected the lights of the city, thousands of individual points of illumination that together created something beautiful and enduring. For the first time in decades, Grace felt entirely, undeniably herself. Life doesn't end just because it breaks once. What falls apart can be the very place where we learn to stand again. If this story gave even a small moment of strength to someone out there, then everything I went through means something today. Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who see our love as weakness, our age as opportunity, our kindness as an invitation to take what they think we don't deserve to keep. But they forget something important: we are more than the sum of what they can steal from us. My father understood something that Mark never could, that real security doesn't come from controlling other people, but from building systems strong enough to catch us when we fall. The card he gave me wasn't just about money. It was about remembering that we are worthy of protection, worthy of planning ahead, worthy of having options when the world tries to convince us we have none. If this resonated with you, please like and subscribe, and share a piece of your own story in the comments below. Your words might become the seed of the next chapter we create together. Thank you for spending